So if you look at Canvas and get the beautiful white presentation, we'll get started taking a look at this stuff. Now, in this chapter, we're talking about summary queries. What is a summary query? Let me show you. Here's a picture of one, and we'll get on Google and see if we can find some. But you see this little report up here? Let me zoom in. This is the kind of information that managers often want. So they don't want a list of this person's clients, 252 clients, right? Normally they're not going to care about that, but they do want to know how many clients this doctor has and how many villages they serve and how many crops. So anytime we're looking at data like this, it's been summarized, we're talking about a summary query. Somehow we've gone out and we've said, I want to select all of these plants and all of these different numbers and summarize them. Let's look at Google and see if we can find some pictures of some others. I'm just going to open up a tab and search for summary query. Maybe summary report. And then look at images and see what I get. Well, you can see right away it's a common thing, right? We have a lot of them. I'm going to look at this summary report of cars sold. This is pretty simple. This summary is just based on the make and color of the car. What's the total sale price that's been received? So for black Fords, they've sold 175,000. Blue Fords only 45,000. Everybody really likes black. So looking at a summary query like this, we can really quickly make those kinds of analysis statements. Well, it's like black is a lot more popular than blue. So summary queries are really, really useful for a lot of different things and really important. Now, if we look at some of these others, you'll find some things that are in Excel. You'll find some things where they've done a summary and then done some graphing or charts or something based on that summary. So it's important for us to be able to get to our data in other places so that we can summarize it. Look at that in this chapter too. Okay, so summary queries. What does the term aggregate mean? It's got it in our book right away. Should we dictionary.com it? I'm not hearing a lot of definitions. What does aggregate mean? And an aggregate is a whole. It's a whole thing, but it's a whole thing formed by combining several different parts. So I could almost think of a pie as an aggregate, right? Because I take all these ingredients and do things with them, and when I'm done, this summary result is a pie. But when we're looking at SQL, we're usually looking at creating some sort of total, a total or a count or an average, you know, some sort of meaningful number like that. And so that whole number is going to be formed by combining several different rows, several different pieces of information to form that summary, that aggregate. So let's try some. I'm going to open SQL Server Management Studio. Go ahead and get that open and get connected. While you're getting that open, when we're using aggregates, we're going to be using SQL functions. And SQL functions are built in, just like the functions we would use in any programming language. So we might use a date function, or we might use a random number function in another programming language. We can do the same thing with SQL. There's some built-in functions. These functions that we're going to be using this week are called aggregate functions because that's their purpose, is to summarize or count data. So they do special things for us. Now, whenever we're using these aggregate functions, they're going to appear in our column list. So instead of just saying, I want to get the invoice number and the invoice total, we could say, I want to get a sum of the invoice total. and that's going to be a column function. They're column functions because they replace a column in our select statement. Whenever we put these in a query, that query becomes a summary query. One of the most important ones we can use is the count function. We have lots of different functions available, so I'm going to switch over to that PowerPoint. Let's look at the first one they show us. Here's the overview of all of the different aggregate functions, and I'm sure there's others, but these are the ones that we'll be looking at. So count is just like it says, it counts how many rows it sees or is processed. Average will calculate the average of a given field. Sum will calculate the sum. Minimum will find the minimum out of a whole series, and maximum will find the maximum out of a whole series. So these aggregate functions are what we'll be adding to our queries to make them into summary queries so that we can get summarized information out. So here's the first one that they have, a count query. I'm going to open my database. I'll still put that use statement in there, but I like to be in the right place. It makes me feel better. So I want to create a new query. Last time we saved that project, and I didn't see any benefit from doing that. So I'm just going to save each of these queries out in my folder. But if you saw benefits, I'll continue to use it that way. I should make that all uppercase, shouldn't I? All right, so I'm set up with my database, and I'm going to do a select statement. Whoops, you guys can't see it. And I want to select count. So count is a keyword. It's a function name. Notice it turns a different color in the Management Studio IDE. Now, whenever I am using the count function, I have to pass a parameter to the count, and the parameter is going to specify what should be counted. And in this case, we're going to use a star, meaning just count the rows, count them all. Now, we want that count function to display with a nice column name. We're going to call it number of invoices. We also want to include a sum. And we want our sum to be all of those outstanding invoice amounts that we've been calculating since we started working with this database. And we're going to call that sum total due. Now, once I put in my from clause, my errors should go away, right? Because right now it doesn't know what table I'm looking at. So from my invoices table. Now we're going to go ahead and add a where clause because we only want those invoices where we have an outstanding balance. So we'll put our where clause of where invoice total minus payment total minus credit total is greater than 0. Let's run that. So there's our total due. Now I could also sum just the invoice total on that. Let's try it. I'll just change that sum to only do the invoice total instead of that whole calculation. So we get a different number, a little different. We haven't paid much on those outstanding invoices, it looks like. So the count function gives us this number, how many invoices were actually processed in our select statement or selected by our select statement. And then the sum gives us this number, the total of all of those numbers. So you guys can picture it, right, in your program. If you were writing a program code to do this, you would start some sort of loop, and in your loop, you would be adding to account for each invoice and adding to your total for each one. So you could do that loop yourself.
Can you format with SQL like currency?
Uh-huh. Let's look, because I know they're going to show us how, but they haven't yet, and it's getting kind of old. So I'm going to go search SQL currency format. The first one that I see is from Microsoft, so it might be useful. I'm going to try it. See if there's examples down here. Date, time. Hate looking at Microsoft stuff. It's like, here, I'm going to tell you everything except what you asked for.
It's right, yeah, it's right there. Currency format. It's in here. Yeah, it's right there.
This one.
Format, end of day rates, C, and then that's currency format. Right there, yeah.
So we would have to do, let's see, I don't know if we can do
Let's just say.
Oh, wait, hold up.
DE is just.
the locale, yeah.
Yeah, scroll up, you'll see the English thing.
Oh, okay. So let's try it. So where do we format that? We have to format within our select statement. Yep. So format. And then let me get rid of these comments. And after our calculation, I would specify my formatting character of C. No, I shouldn't have to specify locale because our English US should be the default locale. Let's make sure. And then we get a nice $sign. So super easy to do. What we're doing then is we're taking that sum, that aggregate function, and wrapping it in a format function. So just the same way as you would do that in a programming language, we can do it here. Looks good. I want to save that one. I'm going to create a folder for it and put all my chapter 5 stuff in there. And then this will be total outstanding invoices. Okay, the next one they want us to do adds a little bit more. I'm going to create a new query and add my use statement. This one's going to give us all sorts of great examples. So we're going to say after, this is just going to be a heading. Remember, if we create a string like this, we're just adding this to our column list as a literal. So we're going to see this after 9/1/2015 in every row if we were to look at all those rows. We're going to also select account as number of invoices. My O needs to be uppercase there. Then I want an average of the invoice total, and I'll call that average invoice amount. And I want a sum. of all those invoice totals. And we'll call that total invoice amount from our invoices table. And we're going to specify a where clause here. We want to make sure that the invoice date really is greater than at 09/01/2015. Oops. You can see a query like this would be really common because it's probably something that would be set up as a standard query that would run automatically because management would be very interested in these kind of numbers all the time. We could actually have an application that ran this query in the background to display this information on a web page or something like that for our management. Now it shows us this literal after 9/1/2015, which we added to our column list. We had 114 invoices. This was the average amount, and this was the total amount. So how could I format both of those as currency? I should just be able to wrap it in that format. Function. Give it a second here. Missing parentheses.
I think it wants that as statement outside of that function.
Is that my problem? You're so good. I'll move it. Fix all my commas here. So watch what you're doing. I was trying to wrap my as clause, which is not going to make it happy with it, obviously. Could we do a lowercase c? Would that do the same thing? Try it. Let's run it. It doesn't seem to care, does it? So everybody got that? Got that one saved? Let's save it. This is going to be total invoices with an average. Notice when we're doing this summary query, we're only getting out one line. We're not getting out a result set for every invoice. All of those invoices are being processed by the select statement, and the data is being summarized in memory, and then our result set is only that summarized output. So we have a lot of power here to summarize. Okay, let's use the minimum and max. I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this one. In a new query. And for this one, we want to select, and we're going to use that literal thing again after 9/1/2015. That'll be our selection date. Then we want to add a count. And a max. And we'll call that highest invoice total in our output. And then we're going to use the minimum function to get the minimum invoice total. And we're going to call it lowest invoice total from our invoices. And we want to add a where clause to select only those invoices that meet that criteria of being greater than 0901. I'm going to execute this. It says that I have 114 invoices, with this $37,000 invoice being the highest and a $6 invoice being the lowest. I'd like to validate that. So I need to do some additional selects to make sure. First of all, I'm just going to select star from invoices, maybe. And I'm going to highlight that when I run so that that's the only line of code that executes.
On your where clause, just the format on the date, it should be like that, year, date, month, and the date. Because it should-
You can change it, but yes, that's what you should use if you're trying to set a date or compare to a date. Mhm. Okay, so let's run this. And if I look at this query, I see 114 rows. Is that what my count said? Let's try it. Run it again. 114. So that count looks correct. It's easy enough for us to validate just by selecting everything from our invoices. Now it also says our maximum is this $37,000 one. So we could select from the invoices again, and we could scroll down through that invoice total. What else could we do that would be a little easier? Order by. And I'll go ahead and say descending because we're looking for that maximum one right now. And there it is, that $37,000 one does look like it's the highest one by quite a bit. So when you're running queries, you have to make sure that your output results are valid. So whatever steps you have to do to kind of analyze your data to make sure you're getting valid results are important. I'm going to save this one. And we'll call this min max invoice total. Now we could do that same thing using alphabetic data. Let's create a new query. And this time, we're going to select the minimum on our vendor name. We'll have our minimum be called first vendor, and our maximum, or our vendor that starts with the letter Z, is the last vendor. And then we're going to add a count function in here, and we're going to count on vendor name as number of vendors. And then finally, we'll add our from clause that we want to do all of this from vendors. When you guys create a better SQL, I hope you make it to where that from clause is a little smarter. Okay, let's try it. Oh, we got Abby Office Furnishings as our first vendor and Zilka Designs is our last. So it is able to do that alphabetic sort to get that minimum and maximum.
So is it like, if you had like a name D, would that come up as last, or is it just the first one to trigger?
No, it would come up last.
So it's not just off the first letter.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Does it grab alphabetically as well, so lowercase c be further down than higher?
Mm-hmm. It should be, let's run it. We should be able to tell if we add, I'm going to copy this select statement. And I'm going to take our minimum, max, and maximum functions out. And then we'll order by vendor name. And if I just run that query, oops. I'm going to have to get rid of those parentheses. I was hoping I didn't have to. I was being lazy. Oh, I think it's just bad because it's in there twice.
Well,
So,
you got rid of the premise around the count.
it's going crazy here. Let's get rid of that count function because I'm trying to do an aggregate function with a scalar query. And a scalar query is one where we want to return every row. So get all of the aggregate stuff out of there, and it should be happy. Now, if I look at all of the vendors, our max and our min functions would use the same sorting as our order by clause. So we can see Abby sorted before American Booksellers, which sorted before American Express. So it should be doing a full sort with those minimum and maximum parameters. We should see that last one be our Zilka design. So yep, it's good. All right, so let's save that one. And this will be alpha, min, max. The next thing that they mention is the distinct keyword. And if you remember, we saw at the beginning that the distinct keyword would make it to where we only saw one row if there were many rows that duplicated each other. So if we had a result set that had the same vendor number 5 times, but we said distinct, we would only see it once. We can actually do that with our summary queries too. Let me show you this one that we're gonna put in. We've got a select count distinct vendor ID, and that's going to give us how many vendors we have, but then we're counting just on vendor ID for the number of invoices. We're averaging the invoice total and averaging the invoice amount. Hang on, I want to look at our database diagram so we can think about why. There's a gnat up here. I got him. Ugh. Great. Why do we need the distinct keyword? In our query here, we're pulling from invoices. If I look at our invoice table, every row in our invoice table has an invoice ID and a vendor ID. Is there a chance I could have the same vendor ID more than once in this? There is. So since I'm using invoices as my query table, if I really want to count the unique vendors, I need to add that distinct keyword so that I don't count all of the invoices that I read, only invoices that have a unique vendor ID. Okay, so let's put that query in. Another new one. So our first count, we're going to use the distinct keyword on vendor ID. And we'll call this number of vendors. Now our count on vendor ID is going to tell us how many invoices there are. So notice that's just a function of the way our data is stored. It's not something that, you know, is an accounting thing. It's just the way we have it saved. We're going to do an average on our invoice total. Call that average invoice amount. And one more sum on invoice total. And we'll call that total invoice amount. And then we want to use our invoices table where our invoice date is greater than 2015-09-01. So our query actually processed 114 rows, all of the different invoice rows in our table. Of those 114 different rows, it saw 34 different vendor numbers or vendor IDs. So that makes sense. For each vendor, we have multiple invoices.
Is there a way to be sure that the average and total are in fact pulling that from all of the invoices and not just the distinct invoices?
We should be able to. Where's our average? Let's see, I have that previous query that was our total invoices with average. I'm going to go back to it, and it says our average amount was $1879.74. $1879.74. So we.
So it sounds like because we didn't tell it to be distinct in the average and sum like we did in that first count, it is in fact doing that to all of them.
All of them. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's a good point. Okay, so what if we didn't want that to happen? Seth just is such a great lead-in person here for our next little topic. If we didn't want that to happen, we only want to somehow control what invoices are included in these amounts. Well, there's another clause that we can use that we haven't really used before called the having clause. So in our syntax, the having clause is kind of like the where clause. So a where clause can have a group by. A having clause can have an order by. So they're very, very similar. The difference is that the where clause works on our scalar rows, every row that's coming across that query. The having clause limits in the same way where something equals something. The having clause is going to impact those groups, our totals, our chunks, instead of just each individual row. So we can limit what gets shown in our totals using the having clause. So let's try some. So make a little more sense. In this example, we're going to calculate the average invoice amount by vendor. And like Seth mentioned in our last query, we ended up with the average invoice amount of all the invoices. How do we get a nice little report that shows us what the average is for each vendor? Let's try this. I'm going to save this one. Count distinct, I guess. Now for our query here, we're going to get the vendor ID. And then for every vendor ID, we want an average of their invoice total. Not all of the invoices, but just for this specific vendor. We'll call that average invoice amount. From our invoices table. So this group by clause is actually part of the having clause. Because I'm saying here, I want to group my data by vendor ID, and I only want to include in my output query those groups that have an average that is greater than $2,000. And of those, I want to order them by the average invoice amount. So notice how the having clause is much different than the where clause. Because if I use the where clause and I said where invoice total is greater than 2,000, that would be for that one particular invoice. So I might not get very many. But here I'm saying where the total invoice for this vendor is greater than 2,000. So it's a different level that I'm applying that selection. Okay, so let's run that and see. So now we see an average invoice amount for each different vendor. And we're starting to get to that kind of data we were looking at first of a summary report that's showing all of this information. Now, how could we be sure that's right? In this one, we have to do a little bit more analysis. Let's say we could select star from invoices where vendor ID equals 110. Now, I don't know if that's going to be a good vendor ID to grab or not, but that's that first one. I think I'll try like 99. That guy might have a bunch. And then I want to run the select statement. Well, that one's easy. That should be our average, right? 6940. And sure enough, 6940. So I think I'll try a different one. He only had one invoice. I'll try vendor 86. He only has one invoice. I keep getting ones that only have one. Get the idea. I'll have to go to this 110. He's going to make me do it. Okay. There they are. So looking at all his invoices, that average seems okay. I'm going to save this. This one is going to be a having and order by. So I have to group things to have a having, because if I'm not grouping, the having clause doesn't know what to work on. So I'm going to be grouping things and then saying, okay, if it's having this, that's a good spot. I think that's a good spot for us. We should have enough information now to complete the recall thing. Let me double check. Looking at the recall thing, you guys knew how to do that one. This one we should do as a count. So even if you already had like, we got 12 rows back, so it was 12. It would be nice if you verified that with a query that did a count. Product ID 2, list of mailing addresses of affected customers. You should have been able to do that one already. And then this one is the one that we should know how to do better today. List the total amount spent by customers on this product. Now there was one error. This second slide, your version says invoice number, and it should say order ID, because we're looking at order data, not invoice data here in this example.
And do you want the SQL code on that PowerPoint?
No.
No, but I do want it like to the side.
Like,
Yeah, just create a Word document or something that has it. Now, you guys are going to finish up with that pretty quickly, so be sure to, spend extra time getting started on this chapter's exercises. Some of them are, we want you to be able to explore this quite a bit, so this chapter sometimes can take a little bit longer getting all of those exercises done. We have about half of the presentation left for Thursday to talk about other functions here of our aggregate queries, and we should have some time then Thursday to finish up that exercise. All right, let's get with your groups and get these things done. I saw what you were running. Oh no, there's another one up here in the front. I hate it when that one is closed. It kept doing it to me last year when I was sick all the time. I wanted to just walk in there and show them. Hey.
New groups that we're in, and or is it still
It's the same group. It's the same group.
we did previous weeks.
So it should be the one in Canvas.
that's weird. I don't keep track of it. Well, I was like 90% sure that was mine, but I'm like, I'm